Hello. Screen share. Why aren't you working? Screen share. Why aren't you working? Hi. So this is a little test of using YouTube Live to share some API development. Because I need to figure out how to not hear my own voice echo back to me 3 seconds later. So I've muted my microphone. I don't know if you can still hear me, but anyway, there was a suggestion on the Revit Ideas forum yesterday about making an uh, override dimension text. And so I've made this little macro. I'm going to need to switch. So I wrote this macro yesterday as a sort of little proof of concept to show that we can override a dimensions text through the API. The problem they described in the ideas post is that sometimes the text that you're trying to override is not visible. Also, that you can, by mistake, move the text when you're trying to click on it to bring up the override dialog. So if we come over to Revit now, see if screen sharing will actually share my entire screen, which it didn't seem to want to do before. There we go. So here's Revit, and if we create a dimension, two-segment dimension and a one-segment dimension. To override this text, we have to click on the text itself, and then I can type in a prefix. If you want to, but if you're in a view and visible, there are also tricks where you override the text with some invisible character, and that makes it harder to select the text itself. Sometimes also when you select the text, you might move it by mistake, and you don't want to do that. And anyway, the idea was, can we create some way to just select the dimension and get that text to override without having to click on the text itself, just anywhere on the dimension. Of course, that's more obvious if it's a single segment dimension like this, but even segment dimension, we can probably figure out a way to do that too. So I wrote a little bit of code in a macro here to show how this can work, right? We prompt the user to select a dimension, then pick some given error segment dimension, at least in this case, and here's some initializing that we'll later set on the dimension. Then we show a form, bring up some user interface to let the user pick some values, get the values from the dialog. And then here we actually make the dimension above and below text, replace with text. If that's null, then we'll set a prefix and suffix. But if we look at the Revit user interface, right, when we have a replace with text, there is no prefix and suffix, it's only above and below. So we'll always set above and below, replace with text. If that's not the case, then we will set a prefix and suffix. If we are using replace with text, then we'll do the value override. So we can run this. Put any of the user yet, so we can just put some fake text in here. And on the macro, that was something else I was testing for that. Right, so now we're prompted to pick a dimension. I pick this dimension, bring up the empty user interface, and I actually coded in here, cancel from the dialog, we're going to abort from the macro. So for this example, let's just comment that out. Now when we run the macro and pick this dimension, dismiss the dialog, you can see that we did get some values here overriding that dimension. Those values actually came from the not these values that I entered, but from the sort of dummy functions that I had created for the user interface here. We're going to get the values. Of course, this really needs to be done from the user interface or from the dialog, which is not yet coded. But just as a test, we can see that this is working, and right, so far so good. I guess it's cool that there's a few people. So if you want to chime in the chat window with any questions or comments, please do so. So let's take this code now. I created an empty out of the macro where I was doing some quick testing where we can leave it there as well and start coding the UI here in Visual Studio, or sorry, in Sharp Develop. Right, I did project add new item and selected here the form to create the user interface. I think in general, at least I don't use the macro environment to create UI, but that's certainly something you could do. And it is a great environment to go back and forth quickly without having to recompile and exit Revit and all of that. So So what should we do next? If we want to start working on the UI, we can do that. Honestly, don't do that very often. Sharp Develop, so where they're editor for that is. I'll have to take a look and try and figure out where that is. So there's a design tab somewhere. Oh, there it is. Right in front of me the whole time. So now we can start adding some user interface. And now we can show the toolbox. All right, so here's a text box we'll add for the above text. Now it takes a little bit of time to get used to this interface and not being in Visual Studio, but so text above, and we'll make another one. We'll put below, text below. and exe prefix, and we'll put suffix over there. Let's add an OK button. And now we have the OK button. We can uncomment out this line here. And let's come back and instead of these dummy entries, we'll actually replace those with txt below text. Txt prefix text, txt suffix text, txt above text. One thing we're going to want to do is we're going to want to populate these input panel initial values. So here, so I'm already changed the constructor for form dim text to take a dimension as the input. So now we can populate those values. We can say that txt above text is equal to above, and do the same thing for the other controls. All right, so now if we compile this and come back here, let's see what we semicolon there. So now that compiles. We pick this dimension, populate the values in here with what was on the screen already. So say new text above, okay, and so now we see again the new text there, so that's working correctly. And if we cancel and get rid of that, I thought the next interesting thing to do, right? So this is fine with a single segment dimension. We can also do the replace text, which isn't done yet, so let's add that in. I right now have that always returning null. So let's come back here and add that. Okay, so now the dialog will resize a little bit better, setting up some anchors. Let's create another text boxes in the middle. That'll be for the replacement text. We can create labels for all this stuff too. That's uh, super exciting. We can add that later. This will be called uh, txt replace. I guess we want to let people replace with something empty and also replace with some uh, actual values. I think that maybe what we should do is checkbox that says replace with empty, or have a pair of radio buttons. We can say do not replace. Let's look at what does the Revit interface do. Yeah, so actual or replace. We just mimic that. Find the radio button. Name this. Name of the text. And we'll have, at least for now, we'll turn that on by default. And we're going to say when actual value is changed, that radio actual is checked. Then txt not enabled. Otherwise, txt replace will be enabled. So then for our get replacement, we can say if replace is enabled, and return the txt replace text, else then we'll return null. So this is how we'll know if we're using replacement text or not. And see what should we do next. Well, we can run it. Stuff is working, so do that. Pick the dimension. Do some resizing here. Say replace with, and we'll just check that we can remove some of these things. So there, value as we before in the text, it was using only the above and below, not the prefix. That's all good. Let's come back in here and move that over so it's not being blocked. So that's most of the functionality that Revit has right there. I thought what would be interesting to do next would be to handle multiple dimension string. All right, so right now, if we come back and we try and run this on our segment dimension, we're going to get this error because we don't know which segment to work with. And that's fine. Let's try and remove that restriction now and go from there, right? So we'll just comment out the code for that restriction. Now with that removed, we can run it. We'll see that we're going to get an error when we do because all right, so we cannot access this property if the dimension has more than one segment. And here's the difference is if we bring up the help file, there's only a single segment in the dimension, you can use the property dimension above. And as it says, it's for use with single dimension segments only. For multi-segment dimension, properties of the dimension segment class. So what we're going to want to do now is we're going to build a list of dimension segments. And so let's make some space in our dialog box for that. Well, let's just fix some anchors for these guys that we created. Okay, so let's move all this stuff over a bit. And we're going to create a list of dimension segments. There's a few different ways we can do this. We want to give, useful to be able to distinguish, okay, well, that's a dimension and that's an 8-inch dimension. Of course, both of them are 8, then, or they're even, right? So if this is 14, then just putting in the text isn't enough. We could give the user some information about the objects that are being referenced, and that might help a bit more. So let's start off with the dimension string only. So make a list here, and we'll call this segments. And now in here, we're going to branch the code a little bit so that we say that, first of all, if the dimension segments is equal to 1, then we're going to do this stuff here that we were doing before. And we're going to say that our list of segments will be disabled. This is not really going to have a whole lot of meaning. Else, we will say segment is enabled. It's true. And we're going to go through those segments and this box with some information. So dimension segment array is one of these weird old things from the Revit API. Right, it's an enumerable with these forward iterators and get enumerator methods. List instead, and add some statements in here like link and collections. So now we can have our list of dimensions segments is going to be equal to dimension segments, but we can't just do that. We need to do a cast. Right, because this will give us this error about it. Converting the dimension segment array to a list. So what we can do is a cast segment and then to list. Now we have them in a sort of more standard C# list object, and then we can say for each dimension segment yes. Make the name a little better. So let's just test out this little bit with a multiple segment dimension. Hey, there's 4 people watching now. So welcome to person number 4. Let's move this wall back. So here, so we have a 20-inch dimension and or 20-foot and 8-foot dimensions. So now when we run this and we just pick anywhere on the dimension, here we have, as hoped for, our 2 different dimension segments. Now let's do the work to populate the existing controls with any overrides that were set. So to do that, let's actually set some overrides. So we'll say 8 prefix, 8 below, which is a little bit colder than the weather here today. There's an example of dragging the thing by mistake when we're trying to double click. And the above, so forth. So now we want to read in those values to populate the UI. So let's come back in here. So we're basically going to do some, we need to have a way to identify the dimension segment when the user is going to click on this text box, right? So the way that's going to work is the dimension segment is not an element, so it doesn't have a element ID or anything nice we could use like that, right? If we look at its set of properties. Well, maybe the unique thing that we use to identify them is the origin, because the origin of each segment in the dimension is probably unique, even if the values are the same. or the text position would be the other option. I thought there might be a way in here to get the actual references of that dimension segment, but it seems like not. Seems like a good request to Autodesk, because certainly for dimension, we can get the references. And with those references, let's look at the dimension segment array. The references can be mapped to segments in order. So the first segment is wrapped by the first and second references. So maybe we'll use that later, but for now, let's maybe go with the origin. I'm gonna grab a little bit of text to show how we can do that, right? We could put the origin text actually in the dialogue. That sort of would rather, I think, just list the value itself. But actually, if we want to show the origin text, we can do that. Anyway, so we're going to add this on index changed code, but again, up here, say we're going to add the dimensions string. And we're going to add to that the dimension string origin value. So what you do now is take some text like this and put it down in here. But first, we are going to need to find what that dimension segment is, right? So if we, for example, put use a character like the tilde as our separator, and say that the string array is going to be equal to the segment text split at the tilde. And then the origin string Yep. So the origin string is going to be second item in that array, because it's 0 based, it would be item 1. And then we could come back and use some code. Actually need to make sort of have global access to that dimension. But we can get to it from that other function. So let's do that and give that a different name, and then we'll set this global version of the dimension to the local version passed in here. Now we can access that dimension down here and again get the segments. But this time, instead of a list of dimension segments, we just want to get the single segment whose origin matches that selected value. So let's change our, instead of just saying to list here, first or default, and do that where origin to string equals the origin string that we got from the text in the list. It looks like joined, so welcome, and feel free to ask any questions in the chat window if you'd like. So now we should have the dimension string, the dimension segment, and then we'll use that segment now to populate the existing UI. So let's just run this bit and now come back to Revit. Run that. We pick the 2-dimension segment. And see that working, right? When I pick the corresponding value here, we are seeing the user interface update with those values. Okay, we still have some more work to get the whole thing running, but it's a step in the right direction. Let's just a little wider. I can imagine we will end up wanting to move this into a grid or something else if we continue using the origin, but in any way, let's keep going. I think this sort of incremental development ends up working better than trying to do it all at once. So we'll do that, and now we're going to want to, when we hit OK, figure out which segment was selected. So let's also pass back, again, I think using this org, at least for now, seems as good as anything. So let's come back into this dialog and way to get the origin. It's going to be the same as what we were doing here. So let's just take that out of here. Getting it. All right. We'll put that here, and then we'll say that we're going to return origin string. And so then that code is written once there. It's going to be used here. We can just replace that with get origin. And we're also going to use get origin here when we come back and we want to decide which dimension to use, right? Because we're still going to have exceptions here. So again, we can say that if the dimension equals 1, and do it this way, actually, right, modifying the dimension itself. If or else, now we need to get the origin above, which we will add in here. Let's get the value. So we have the value now. Now with that value, we can come down here, right? So there's more than one dimension, so we need one segment. So let's get the segment we need, which is we were using in the form. But instead of using, we've already called get origin, so we can just do this. And then it's going to be same code here, but just instead of working on the dimension class, we're going to work on the dimension segment class. So we'll use this segment option, that segment, and segment. All right, so I think we've made some good progress. Let's come back and run this now. The segment count. Sharp Develop does crash sometimes. Let's come back and open back up and get back to work. All right, here we are. Try and compile it again. What is it called? It's not segment count. Number of segment name for that thing. So that compiled. Let's come back and try and run it now. Pick that multiple dimension. So here's the one that says 20 above. Let's remove that. We'll call it 20 below. And hit OK. And hey, right, so it left our top one as is, the 8 prefix and 8 below, and did the 20 below for us. And so that's cool. What we're not allowed to do, or what we aren't doing right now, is storing both of these values. So if I change the 8.1 to something and then change the values for the other segment of the dimension, we would lose the the data that had been set here, right? If I came here and said, prefix 8, then I come here, right now I've just lost what I typed in. Could add some confirmation dialogue that says, hey, do you really want to, make this change, or hit OK and apply that before you pick a different segment. Or we could, of course, enhance it further to actually store that value. I know sometimes people do replace with something that's empty. Let's take a look at that. So if I say 20 and replace with, but this has nothing in it. Looks like that doesn't work. Let's check the pick 20. We'll say replace, and we'll type in something. All right, so that worked. If you do want to replace with something empty, I think there are tricks to do that with, again, with invisible characters or things like that. Let's actually take a look. Revit API. Mention. Someone. All right, so here's some ideas about what good blank characters work. So let's actually code that. So they were saying use the US unit separator. We'll come back to the dialogue and Let's add a checkbox to say replace with, or we can just add another radio button that says replace with empty. Might be the most explicit way to do it. So let's see, we'll say replace with empty. And let's name it RDO replace B. Now that we have 3 radio buttons, let's take our enabling code, and should actually happen when replace with is changed. And we'll just flip around the logic so that if it's RDO replace is checked, then that's true. And that's false. And then in our get, if RDO replace empty is checked, then return. We'll just replacing that with a new line. Let's come back here. Let's go back to the single. Let's try this. So that was the 21. I said replace with empty, and looks like that didn't work. Let's just make sure that we have so the new line, let's actually just put something in there for starters. Now pick it. And we also need to get selected, because if nothing's selected, it doesn't make a whole lot of sense. Didn't actually change anything. So let's try and figure out what if replace empty is checked, we return the DD. Replace with text. That's null. Segment gets the value override. Let's just put a quick task dialog in here. All right, I'm going to pause for a little bit and come back later. Thanks for joining.